All right, thank you everybody for being here today. Today we're going to talk about our 2022 dry bean research, and in particular our evaluation of our unique end use traits of species. You guys should be looking at a title screen now, and if not, feel free to let me know. So to kind of give you guys some background on where these samples do come from, all the varieties that we'll discuss today that were included in our trials, were sampled from the 2022 dry bean performance trials. So this is extension publication E3465 that came out on November 8th of 2022 this year. So this publication contains yield and agronomic information on 160 entries across 12 market classes this year. A copy of this was sent to every dry bean grower in the state of Michigan and is also freely available online as a digital resource. The easiest way to find it is if you Google E3465 MSU. It should come up in the first link or two there for your information. Average yields this year, I would say, we're average to above average with excellent quality. You can see our different county locations there. From Sanilac down to Tuscola, with our average yield across all entry in pounds per acre adjusted to 18% moisture, ranging from 18 to 32 bags to the acre. With that low number at the bottom at Tuscola, 18 would have been a kidney bean trial that we had without irrigation. So that'd be a bit of our outlier for our locations this year, with the majority ranging that 28 to 3,200 pounds to the acre. But group knows that's logged onto our cane evaluation. When we talk about dry beans, there's much more than just yield. We really have to think about where these beans are headed to anyhow, and what qualities are important to us, such as seed shape, size, color, and integrity after cooking. Give you guys some more background on these trials. These were from 6 locations that were strategically placed in Michigan. Within our different microclimates, to best, gauge both our agronomic performance in our dry bean production region, as well as the potential differences in cooking quality that we can see across those different regions, dependent on what that environment had for moisture, for warmth, all those things that go into dry bean crop for a year. And I often get asked, so we have 160 entries. Where did these come from? Who decides what entries we test? And the answer to that is actually quite simple. This is public testing. So anybody can enter varieties into this testing. Breeders from across North America are contacted in March of each year, and they're solicited for entries. And this is considered a fee for testing type program that has a goal of breaking even. So it's a very low cost testing that allows us to provide great information to both of our breeders as well as our growers in the state of Michigan for these locations. So dry beans are sourced in March. Once we get a final entry list of what we're going to test, we go into the experimental design phase. We use specialized software to lay out our field maps for the year. So this is an example of this. It's often done in April, ahead of contacting our cooperators. This is a 2.5 acre plot that we had up in Huron County last year. You can see each of these different colored blocks are a different trial, with navy beans on our left, black beans in the middle, small reds up here in the front, a little bit smaller trial, Great Northerns, Pinos, and then we actually have blacks here on the end too, which each small individual rectangle in there being an individual plot. So each rectangle there on field scale is about 150 square feet, composed within that trial that are strategically laid out in experimental design that's called a randomized complete block. And that really helps us account for our variability across the field, across soil types. So that way we can produce the highest quality data as possible in a commercial production environment. So once our experimental laid out, then comes the real work. So we use that software to print off our planting envelopes. Those envelopes are often numbered 1 through 5 to 600, depending on how many plots we have. They go together like a puzzle. So seed counter with an electric eye that actually allows us to pack each of these seed envelopes to a precise planting population. So that way every variety is standardized for what that population was planted. Most often that's 100 seeds per packet. And then those packets are arranged into that puzzle that allows us to plant across that randomization. It creates an efficient method of production for us. So when it comes around to June, our dry bean planting season here in Michigan, we're right out there alongside our commercial producers, working in commercial farms within their fields, planting our dry bean plots of those individual packets that we prepared. And each year, that planter will plant anywhere from 12 to 15,000 of those individual packets for planting. So throughout the season, we mentioned that we're working out there alongside our commercial producers, and our plots are maintained just as commercial producers will. We look a little bit different as our scale is a little bit smaller, and we do some things to control traffic. And by traffic, I mean equipment passes where our tire tracks are, things such as that, to help control our variability across the field. But they're maintained just as commercial production would. As we move closer to harvest, through the months of August and September, a big thing that comes up for us, looking at different varieties, is our disease resistance or tolerance to some key traits of interest. We have white mold disease, as an example, on the left, anthracnose in the center on a cranberry bean pot, and then root rot on the right. So we really want to study these varieties and see how they handle our natural disease pressures out in the field, because that's something that's really important to our producers as we look at new genetics. And then once we move into September, we approach harvest. And once again, we're out there right alongside our commercial producers on a little bit different scale. We're harvesting 2 rows at a time with a Wintersteiger Quantum combine. And that allows us to individually bag each of these plots to keep those discrete samples completely separate with no contamination between varieties. So each day when we come home, we have those 160 entries with 4 replications per location, individually bagged separately. So through the months of October and November, that keeps us very busy. All those come back home with us. They're cleaned, re-moisture tested, and those yields are then compiled. That eventually becomes our E3465 that we started this conversation about. That is then published, as soon as we can for our growers to make seed decisions. However, at that same time, thus our conversation today, the research does not stop on those varieties. And that's where we really move into our next analysis of cooking quality and canning that processing. So each of those samples are then cleaned, hand-picked. We re-moisture test and re-weigh so that each individual discrete sample has 100 grams of solid per can for our eventual processing. Once we do get to our actual processing days, which are done in early January at the Food Processing Innovation Center in East Lansing, Michigan, we have an established protocol for both rehydration, our hot soaks, and blanch, individually tailored to each market class. Feel free to take a picture of this, save it for your records, but this is published in our annual publication that should be on the website later this afternoon. That details this whole process out along with our data that has been compiled in the past week as well. So once we go through that, our hot soak, our blanches, those tags are individually matched up to our cans. Our can size is a 307 by 407 can to keep all of our samples, once again, discreetly separate ahead of processing. Once they're matched up in that 307 by 407 can, they're filled with 200-degree brine, which is a mixture of 1.5% sucrose, 1.2% sodium chloride, 0.005% calcium chloride, and 0.02% EDTA for our colored beans only to help prevent oxidation and color retention. Our thermal cycle is standardized across all market classes with a cook cycle of 19 minutes at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a static retort, but we do have 1 rotation during the cool down phase of that cooking process. And they are processed in an Alpax retort. You can see and this has been a new advantage for us here at MSU. This allows us to really ramp up the number of samples we're able to look at in a combined effort between my program, the MSU breeding program, and the USDA dry beans genetics program at MSU. In total, for a course of 3 days, we're able to process anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 cans.
Like that. Yeah.
So once we get through all that process, cans are allowed to equivocate for 3 to 4 weeks, and then we get to evaluations. Some of you were able to make it to our open meeting we had a week ago today, where we actually open all those cans, evaluate them in a public forum. This year, we were lucky enough to have 88 evaluators go through those samples and score them. on a scale of 1 to 5. Here we have some rough examples of what that appearance score does look like. The first one we have for black beans, which are scored separately for appearance and color, with a 1 being our poorest and a 5 being our best. And the same for the rest of our market classes, which are just scored for appearance on that same score of 1 to 5, with a 1 being unacceptable and a 5 being excellent.
You want a sweatshirt if you guys can get something like that on a sweatshirt.
All right. So now we'll move on to discuss more of our market classes in depth. Today, we'll just talk about our commercial entries that we do have there. We do have quite a few number of experimental entries that are also tested in this. But for the sake of time today, we'll stick to just commercials, lines that are actually in commercial production and could be processed this year. So to begin with navy beans, we'll give a quick example of yield too. Based on our largest data set we have, which is a 3-year combined data set across 4 locations in Michigan. You'll see you have yield in pounds per acre on your y-axis, and across your x, you have our actual variety names. Across there, just under 3,000 pounds to the acre, you'll see a green line. And what that green line represents is our mean yield of the trial. So the varieties we really want to focus on are to the right of that. So on the far right, you'll see Liberty, HMS Bounty, HMS Medalist, which is a standard, Victory, Blizzard, and SV 1893GH. So these are lines that are important for us to pay attention to, because these could be either lines that we're already handling like Medalist, or they could be new additions to that market class that farmers are going to be encouraged to adopt based on that agronomic performance. So if we're thinking about processing quality and paying attention to something that we may have not handled before, that's where we want to focus, is on the right end of this graph. So we'll start by looking at some of these images of each of these varieties here. This is just in alphabetical order, so no particular rhyme or reason to how they're structured, but we'll start with Vigilant, which has an average appearance score of 3.9. So slightly above average, not quite to that very good type range. Victory, this is a newer navy bean line for us that's performed very well agronomically with an average appearance score of 3.1. Valiant, this is an excellent canner at that average appearance score of 4.1. T9905 with an average appearance score of 2.5. SV 1893GH with an average appearance score of 2.7. Rogue with an average appearance score of 4.0. ND Polar with an average appearance score of 3.2.
Okay.
Nautica with an average appearance score of 2.8. Merlin, one of our standards for the market class, with an average appearance score of 2.4. Liberty, one of our new high-performing navy beans in the market class, with an average appearance score of 3.1. HMS Medalist, another one of our standards, with an average appearance score of 2.8. HMS Bounty, another one of our newer navy bean varieties that has performed very well agronomically in Michigan, with an average appearance score of 2.7. Blizzard, with an average appearance score of 2.6. Armada, with an average appearance score of 3.8. Argosy with an average appearance score of 3.2. And 213 SP with an average appearance score of 3.0. Before we do move on to any further market classes, I should mention that before these images were taken, our brine was drained. So you can see that there's a relatively low amount of brine in there. It was drained off to help preserve image quality, because when our brine is relatively deep in there, it becomes difficult to see through for that actual image capture. So with that, we'll move on to navy beans, which are scored separately for color and appearance. Our navy bean trial this year had 33 total entries, with 10 of those being commercial and 23 being experimental. I often like to comment on that. I like to see that split we see in black beans with that 10 commercial and 23 experimental. We think we've seen the most agronomic improvement in black beans over the past 5 to 10 years. And it's exciting to see that we're still, 2/3 of our trials in experimental lines that could potentially be better than what we're commercially testing. So I always think that's great news for the future of black beans in Michigan. So if you look at that same graph, we looked at navy beans with yield, in pounds per acre on our y-axis and varieties across the x, with our green line representing our mean. There's a few lines that stand out there, such as Nimbus, Adams, Spectre, Blackbeard, and even a standard of Zenith, coming in just above the mean, which we'll make a few further comments on Adams as we go through our images here. So we'll start with one of our standards. This was Zorro with an average color score of 3.1 and appearance score of 3.7. And I would ask, if you don't have any particular question, please mute your microphone. Thank you. So Zorro has an average color score of 3.1 and appearance of 3.7.
Bueno, yo no tengo nada que ver con ella ni con la marca, pero a veces me invento algo y digo, oye, ¿cómo está bien?
Here we'll move on to our standards. Zenith with an average color score of 4.4 and appearance score of 4.3. So I always think this is a great one to really help show what that color difference we have between some of these. If we look at our Zenith here with that deep black color you can see on the screen, with Zorro with that 3.1, that really helps you recognize the difference between a 3 and a 4 on this color scale. And then we'll move down to Spectre, one of our high performing agronomic lines, with a color score of 3.0 and average appearance score of 3.3. Then OAC Vortex, this will be the first time we looked at this commercial line in the state of Michigan. Average color score of 2.6 and appearance score of 3.2. Nimbus, our top yield performer here in the state of Michigan over the past 3 years, with an average color score of 2.9 and appearance of 2.5. ND Twilight from North Dakota with a color score of 2.2 and appearance score of 2.9. Blackbeard, one of our strong performers agronomically and also a very good processor, looking at that color score of 4.7 and an appearance score of 3.8. Black Tails with a color score of 3.2 and appearance score of 2.6. Black Bear with a color score of 2.5 and an appearance of 2.7. And then our last black bean we have here is Adams with a color score of 2.4 and appearance score of 3.2. So some of you may know Adams was one of our newer black beans that came into this market class. Unfortunately, it did have some quality issues at harvest this year. And we've learned that the foundation seed of Adams will no longer be supported. So what that means for the industry is that Adams seed will no longer be available for our producers going forward. It is not a variety that we would expect to be in the supply chain in significant amounts in future years. So we'll move on to a combined trial that looked at both small red beans and pinks with a total entries of 12, with 4 of those being commercial. So a little bit on the smaller side for us. You look at our varieties across the bottom once again compared to our mean line there in green. And we've had a standard of Viper in the state for a long time. And it still does appear that Viper is holding that top spot in yield, coming in second to a few experimentals, and then Ruby, another small red, and then a little bit behind that would be Coral, a new pink bean for us from Michigan State University. So Viper processed excellently this year. Viper has always been a good canner, but we're surprised at how well it did process this year for both color and integrity in that small red market class, with an average appearance score of 4.4. Then we have Ruby with an average appearance score of 3.3. Slightly more breakage there than Viper. Then our first pink would be Rosetta with an average appearance score of 2.3. And then our second pink would be Coral, the new release we mentioned, with an average appearance score of 2.5 in 2022. Then once again, we'll move on to another smaller trial for us with Great Northern and Pinto beans combined here for the purpose of today's discussion, with a total number of 12 entries there. A few new lines that we want to pay attention to of interest here would be Charo on our far right here for a Pinto bean, performing above that mean trend line, as well as ND Pegasus, which is a Great Northern, and Eiger, which is also a Great Northern, compared to our standard here for Pinos of La Paz. So there's 3, new entries there, 1 in Pintos and 2 in Great Northerns that have performed very well in the state of Michigan. It'll be lines to watch in the future. So we'll start out with the Great Northern, once again alphabetical here with Aries. So this is a 3.3, and this would be our standard Great Northern for Michigan, the few acres of Northerns we have, most of which would be Aries. Then we have Powderhorn with an average appearance score of 3.2. ND Pegasus, that line we mentioned, that's an excellent agronomic performer for us, with an average appearance score of 3.1. Eiger, that other new Great Northern that does well for us with an average appearance score of 3.1. Windbreaker, one of our more standard entries for Pinos with an average appearance score of 2.8. SV6139GR in our Pinot market class with an average appearance score of 3.2. ND Palomino, one of our slow dark Pinots, with an average appearance score of 3.8. ND Falcon, our conventional Pinot with an appearance score of 2.7. La Paz, our standard Pinot here in Michigan, with an average appearance score of 2.6. Charo, one of our newer Pinots that we mentioned, with excellent agronomic performance, with an average appearance score of 3.8. And then Bronco, another one of our slow dark Pinots with an average appearance score of 2.2. All right, so now we'll move on to some of our larger seeded market classes, starting with light red kidney beans. 15 total entries here, 6 of which being commercial. Overall, we had very strong yields this year in our kidney bean market classes, with our irrigated trial there in Montcalm averaging just over 34 bags to the acre, and our dryland site averaging just over 17 bags. So you'll see these are sorted, very similar. to what we look like in our small seeded market classes, where we have yield running across the bottom here with our green trend line representing our mean yield, and then sorted top to bottom by yield. We have Big Red, Cal Early, Red Dawn, Pink Panther, Clouseau, and Ronnie's Red coming down there just below the mean. So once again, we want to focus on the top of these, our lines that are outperforming the mean, such as Big Red, our standard of Cal Early, Red Dawn, as well as Pink Panther. So I'll start with Big Red with an average appearance score of 2.8. Next, we'll have Cal Early, our standard, with an average appearance score of 3.4. We have Clouseau with an average appearance score of 3.5. Pink Panther with an average appearance score of 2.3. Red Dawn with an average appearance score of 2.9. Ronnie's Red with an average appearance score of 2.9. And then we'll move on to dark reds. So a little bit bigger trial here than our light red kidney beans, with 18 entries here in dark reds, 7 of which being commercial. Yield wasn't quite as strong in our dark reds, which typically we would somewhat expect, with a 31 bag average in our irrigated site, and just over 18 bags there in dry land. So they fared a little bit better without the irrigation this year than the light reds had. So a few lines of interest here we'll want to look at. Dynasty would be a new dark red that's really had some pretty strong agronomic performance for us, as well as Epic. Compared to our standards here of Red Hawk and Montcalm, which you can see fall to just above average to below average in this trial, with Dynasty and Epic landing on top. So you'll see our first line here is Dynasty with an average appearance score of 1.7. Next, we have Epic with an average appearance score of 2.7. We have Gallantry with an average appearance score of 2.9. Rampart with an average appearance score of 3.5. Red Rover with an average appearance score of 2.2. Our standard of Montcalm with an average appearance score of 3.0. Another standard in Red Hawk with an average appearance score of 3.0. And then our second to last market class we'll discuss today are white kidney beans. A little bit smaller entry here with 10 entries, 6 being commercial and 4 being experimental. Our average yields were pretty strong at near 34 bags the acre in Montcalm, and then once again, just over 17 bags in our non-irrigated sites. Here's our 3-year data set. Once again, looking at some of our strong performers over 3 years in the state of Michigan for both our irrigated and our dry land sites. If you look at the top, Denali, a new white kidney bean from Michigan State University, has been a very strong performer, as well as ND Whitetail from North Dakota State University. And then we'll have Yeti, falling, a little bit below that mean average line, and then our standard of Beluga coming in there as our lowest performing entry over the past 3 years. So then we have Beluga with an average canning score of 2.1, but you will see that seed shape is that more bullet or lubia that is desired from that variety. Denali, our new top yield performer with an average appearance score of 2.2. Not quite as round as Beluga if you look closely. The ND Whitetail with an average appearance score of 1.9. Snowden, our standard kind of white kidney, more of that kidney bean shape to it, with an average appearance score of 2.2. And then we have Snowshoe. This would be the first time we looked at this with an average appearance score of 1.8. Overall, Snowshoe had very strong agronomic performance for us in just 1 year. You'll see it wasn't in that 3-year data set because we've only had it for 1 season here in Michigan. But in 2022, it did look very strong for yield here, and also a decent seed shape to it with that average appearance score of 1.8. And then Yeti with an average appearance score of 1.8 as well. So then the last market class we'll talk about today are cranberry beans. We tested 13 different entries in this market class, with 7 being commercial and 6 being experimental. Average yields, once again, approaching 34 bags in Montcalm County and just over 17 in our non-irrigated site in Tuscola. So Etna has been our standard in this market class for a long time, and it still appears to be performing above the mean in our larger data set there, followed by Vero, Jester, and Amaranto, all performing slightly above the mean in this market class. So we'll start with Vero with an average appearance score of 3.3 after processing. Navabi with an average appearance score of 1.7. Jester with an average appearance score of 1.9. Fire Stripe with an average appearance score of 2.4. Etna, our standard, with an average appearance score of 2.4. Amaranto with an average appearance score of 2.5. ECC Scotty with an average appearance score of 2.1. And that concludes today's discussion. We'd like to thank everybody for being here today, and also thank our cooperators that allow us to test these varieties on their farms. Because without them, this would not be possible.